Hey everybody, welcome to Tuesday. Guess what? My video from yesterday got demonetized. All the more reason I don't talk about that stuff as much. If you want to see more videos of that type, we must get the Patreon up. So help support this channel. Become a monthly patron. Patreon.com/LeannaK. This video might get demonetized too. Who knows? The crappy thing about demonetizations right now is in a lot of cases there's no way to appeal the demonetizations because YouTube is working at reduced staff because of COVID-19. I don't know why they can't manually review videos from home, but there you have it. So yeah, let's move on. I'm going to talk today about something I've talked about in the past. So those of you who've been watching this channel for a while, there might not be much new here, but there will be new twists, so it will not be totally redundant. This is one of these topics that require refresher courses every so often because people decide to be bloody freaking stupid about this topic, and I'm not quite sure why. For whatever reason, they are. And so I have to continue talking about this stuff, not my choice. We're talking, of course, about power fantasy and gender dynamics and how this sort of thing intersects with a concept called the male gaze. And how many sort of armchair analysis, sort of pop culture analysis, butchers numerous perfectly valid concepts in a race to circle the bowl. So I decided I had to do this when a friend of mine who's very down with gender stuff in this regard kind of sent me an "oh my god" message in frustration because my friend is an artist and this just sort of drove him crazy. The discussion was this reductive. The image was this, a oddly drawn image of sort of stereotypical comic book characters, though I think that if more women in comic books were that thick, there'd be much rejoicing. Though I don't know what's going on with her calves. They're probably the same thing that's going on with this man's very, very sausage-like arms. Those are arms, right? But anyway, the idea is that this hulking brute of a man is okay because that's male power fantasy, but the voluptuous woman is not okay because that's objectification. You've all seen this argument, correct? Combine this with this very strange thing that got hilariously memed the snot out of this sexual polarity concept that men are straight up and down and powerful and women are leaning in and not powerful. This is a concept taken from a totally valid performative gender concept, but completely butchered. This is not the idea. The actual concept that is taught in things like theater is that male poses, if you want to appear more masculine in a character, you stand straight up and down, perpendicular to the audience, to the camera, to make yourself look as large as possible. That's the masculine pose. Very symmetrical, very face on, chest out. To look more feminine, 45-degree angle, twisted somewhat at the waist to make your waist seem as small as possible and to create an S curve. Interesting fact, bishonen in anime are drawn at a 45-degree angle with something of a soft S curve. That it's actually an artistic design thing. It is not the freaking angle, the freaking line. That's nonsense. But this superhero thing, that just got memed. That just got, the piss taken out of it. It was funny. But why is that, rejected for the nonsense that it is? But this assumption that this is male power fantasy, This is objectification. This just gets assumed. And the interesting thing about that is this totally defies the history of comics. The whole superhero genre got going with Superman in 1938. In 1938, America was just coming out of the Great Depression. Regular people had been, well, regular white people had been newly lifted out of poverty that they were thrust into through no fault of their own after the stock market crash. And they were, what was big in that time was a large, powerful force or entity helping up the little guy who needed a hand up through no fault of his own. It was not considered weakness. It was considered a collective reality. So Superman and then Batman and you know, all the characters that followed did not come from a tradition where these big muscle-bound strong men were what the reader wanted to imagine themselves as. No, no, no. Au contraire, superheroes were the you know, more powerful beings that protected regular people. And that's part of the reason that superhero lives traditionally have been so emo and miserable, okay? It's evolved. That was the golden age of comic standard. The silver age with the rise of early Marvel comics sought to make superheroes more relatable, more like us. Spider-Man has a cold. But characters like Spider-Man, Nightcrawler, they weren't drawn as muscle-bound dudes. They were drawn more live, more like a regular person. That's deliberate. So this idea that this, and I mean, let's face it, the standard good guy superhero is not drawn like this. This musculature is reserved for characters like the Hulk or Bane or Juggernaut that are not exactly seen as control of their strength. They are sort of unchecked rage or an unnatural physicality. They are not considered an ideal. See also characters like Blob and Mojo. The characters that are sort of considered ideals, I mean, there are exceptions, you know, as people call him Fat Batman, the Batman version drawn by Frank Miller and popularized by Frank Miller, that he's just wide as he is tall. And a lot of people, myself included, are like, that makes no sense. He's a martial artist. He'd pull things if he were actually built like that. So, you know, there are silly tangents that comics went into. And the problem is you get things like that Frank Miller Batman and things like, you know, Rob Liefeld's art and things like that. And that was a dark period in comics when the speculator market was at its height and people were buying multiple copies of a book and not reading them. And the goal was to make something look as different and as eye-catching as possible so you could print, you know, 6 different covers of a book because people would buy all the covers thinking that they would be worth a ton of money someday because X-Men #1 and Action Comics #1 and Detective Comics #1 are worth a butt ton now. Of course, all it did was almost tank the comic book industry when people realized that those multiple books they were purchasing were worthless because the more books people bought, the more books the company printed. I think comics are still digging themselves out from what that speculator bubble did to the industry. It was a dark time in numerous ways. It was also the time a lot of people my age and somewhat younger got into comics. So that was sort of normalized at the time. But again, people reading those comics don't think this is how I'm supposed to look. People like, this is how superheroes look, right? But then we go to that thing about objectification of women and the idea that women looking like this, again, this is not the silhouette I would have picked for this comparison. But that this is somehow objectifying because this is the male gaze. Now, this is where we have to reset on the male gaze. What the male gaze is, when it came about, what was going on in media at the time, okay? The male gaze is from the early 1970s and was coined by a woman named Laura Mulvey, I believe, not Lara, in an essay, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema. Laura Mulvey says that the essay was essentially a polemic, a rant, if you will. It was not designed to be held up to, fierce intellectual rigor. It was designed to sort of shock the system and challenge the status quo. And at the time, Mulvey had a point. 1970s cinema, 1970s mass media was an era of skinny, hairy guys and impossibly attractive women. It was this mix of a sort of casting off of the 1950s kind of clean-cut military throwback look combined with the sort of sexual awakening that women had when the birth control pill became widely available and all of a sudden women could have sex without worrying about getting pregnant, which led to a sort of blooming of overt female sexuality, including the miniskirt and, huge false eyelashes, women going braless, which at the time was like, and now a lot of us are just like, why would anybody go without a bra? But of course that sort of sexual awakening got co-opted, as it so often does, by, scummy Hollywood executives looking to make a buck. And the shining example, the example I was used to teach the concept of the male gaze in this era of media was actually, believe it or not, porn, 70s porn. Because, that was the rise of guys like Ron Jeremy, who is no woman's ideal. They have to pay women more to do movies with Ron Jeremy because women find him so yuck. And then, beautiful, beautiful women who look sort of like Shannon Tweed and the blonde bombshell type. That is what feminist scholars and feminist critics of the 1970s were talking about. Not muscle-bound dude, hourglass figure woman, disgusting, nasty, hairy guy, hourglass figure woman. It's also taught in the idea of the typical sitcom schlub that, the woman in a traditional sitcom is way too good for the middle-class schlub. That's actually a very narrow window of sitcoms. They sort of, the show Married with Children was sort of a spoof of that sitcom trope, but it did happen. There are as many examples of that not happening in sitcoms as there is, but that's what the male gaze and sort of the gearing of media to male pleasure was getting at. It was not this idea of, ripped, hard-bodied dude, male power fantasy, because that wasn't around in New Hollywood cinema, which is a phenomenon that, for people who don't know, this is a bit of a new thing. I don't think I've talked about this before. In that era, the 60s and the 70s, a new form of sort of what they considered verite, closer to reality. Cinema rose up in Hollywood, designed to cater to a freshly college-educated middle class. So basically, meathead from All in the Family, that guy. So came from a middle-class family, still middle-class socioeconomic bracket, but highly educated compared to his parents. Women, yes, more women went through college, but sort of second wave feminism, it was more common for the woman to go out and work, pay the way for the boyfriend, the husband, to work their way through school. Yes, unmarried couples were just starting to live together. They're scandalous. But, it was sort of considered a team effort. She'd work, he'd go to school, hoping for a larger family income later on when he could go work and she could raise the kids. That was sort of the idea. Now, some women continued to work, but that didn't become really commonplace until a few decades later. So these more intellectual films were primarily aimed at these freshly college-educated men with a side of college-educated women, keeping in mind that post-secondary education was still segregated. Women couldn't attend schools like Harvard at the time. They were not open to women. Harvard didn't fully integrate until 1999. So whenever you think about Harvard as this, paragon of social justice that it makes itself out to be now, yeah, BS. That's an overreaction because they drag their feet on true integration. So in the 1970s, when Mulvey was writing about this, there was a clear issue going on here. That is not reflected in these Marvel movies, the superhero movies where you've got, I always confuse the Chris's. Chris Evans is Captain America, right? Chris Hemsworth is Thor. You got guys like this who are doing the gross low-carb diet so they can get down to like single-digit body fat so they can wear their pants are at. Can you tell this is not my thing? But that's not for guys. That's certainly not for straight men anyway. When you put that sort of man meat in a movie, that's the Disney formula. The Disney formula is one character for the moms, one character for the dads, and then some sort of adorable animal and or alien and or critter and or proxy friend who's closer to the age of younger viewers. That's the Disney model. It's in every single movie they make. That's why Star Wars felt so by the freaking numbers. But because don't forget, the ultimate goal of these characters is to sell toys, right? The extended licenses are hugely lucrative for companies like Disney, and the people purchasing the licenses to manufacture these things aren't told what the movie's about when they make the purchase. So if it isn't obvious, like, okay, this is the bad guy, this is the good guy, this is the character girls are gonna like, here we go. The reason the Porgs took off like crazy was people knew exactly what they were going to be, even though they were a fairly minor part of that movie. Meanwhile, episode 7, retailers got kind of holding a lot of Kylo Ren figures because that character was not exactly as advertised based on looking at him versus what he sort of turned out to be. And keep in mind, this is about kids buying the toys, not older fanboys. It's about kids. The collector's action figure market, and then the stuff that they sell at, toy stores or Walmart, different demographics. This is not the same as that 1970s phenomenon. And if you look at movies like Captain Marvel, the Netflix Jessica Jones, even parts of Black Panther, these movies all focus on women who are front and center, who are powerful, you know, Wonder Woman with her shield going across the World War I battlefield, all that stuff, just because there's some sort of attractive guy in those movies doesn't mean those movies are suddenly for men, just because, you know, Gal Gadot is nice to look at, right? In fact, a lot of people actually thought she was too skinny to play Wonder Woman. She won us all over with her performance. So much for that. Those are forms of female power fantasy. I mean, Captain Marvel is shameless about it. Elements of Wonder Woman are more subtle, but it's certainly there. You know, just because they have Chris Pine there to be sort of that wartime love interest to Steve Trevor. What, is he suddenly a male power fantasy because he gets with Wonder Woman? That's not how the character is written at all. The appearance of the characters, the way you can more accurately contextualize or trope this male figure. I mean, this woman's clearly a fecundity goddess, which is a form of feminine power. Yes, it is. The trope that these sort of beast male characters, again, Hulk, Juggernaut, Bane, the best way you can sort of classify them is of a Frankenstein's monster type character. They're all usually the result of some sort of lab experiment, right? Now, Captain America was too, but different body type. So when a character looks like that, that doesn't tend to read to a comic book fan as male power fantasy. That's almost a kind of hyper masculine, monstrous reality where it's sort of too much raw power. Ganondorf in The Legend of Zelda as well. Power with these characters is often not shown as a positive. You're like the leaner dudes, like Captain America. You know, truthfully, the biggest power fantasy in the Marvel films was Iron Man on a lot of levels. Like, they overdid it with the Tony Stark is awesome in all things. And I get that that was part of the fact that those movies were the ones that sort of launched the whole franchise. And so they wanted to pay respects. But then they totally messed up on the fact that, gee, Scarlett Johansson as Black Widow was introduced in Iron Man 2, and she got the freaking shaft. Pardon the pun in this context. Power fantasies are way more complex than pictures like this make them out to be. Now, this brings us to the issue of, are power fantasies inherently bad? And the answer is no. There are lots of different types of power fantasies, right? When you are sort of, you know, using skills to make yourself sort of certain skills that the audience may share, making themselves more appealing to the opposite sex or the same sex. You know, we see a lot of lesbian power fantasy in Batwoman, man. Like, first of all, show me a dyke bar where every woman looks like that. Yes, please. But also the fact that, you know, all these women are just inextricably drawn to Kay Kane. I mean, yes, they're writing her basically as a Bruce Wayne type character. However, we must suspend disbelief that it actually works that way. It doesn't. Just like it doesn't work for men in the real world that way. You know, what Bruce Wayne had going for him was his money. She really can't say that the same way. You know, there's a certain protagonist bias in romantic subplots in these stories. You just kind of presume that the reason this character is introduced is because, well, they happen to fall for this character. They don't show the characters who weren't interested. They're not relevant to the story, right? But that's no different than rom-coms where, you know, the whole point is for sort of either the sort of awkward every woman character, Zooey Deschanel role number 1 from that era, or the Winona Ryder character from my era, ends up with this kind of magical man, be it Christian Slater or Johnny Depp or, any of those it boys at the time. There's a certain female power fantasy in that she is just inherently special, so special that this very interesting, powerful, magical guy falls for her. That is no less power fantasy than the male equivalent that we talk about all the time. Think about it, okay? Think about the whole princess in the tower or princess, like the Sleeping Beauty thing. The Sleeping Beauty thing is what they use to teach passive female power fantasy. The idea that if you make yourself look physically attractive enough, men will just be inherently drawn to you while you're asleep. And I'm sorry, I don't know about the rest of you ladies, but most of us don't sleep like perfect, like a little angel in our little glass bed, right? We're just resting our eyes. We're so pretty. We're even smiling a little bit. We don't have like resting bitch faces. No, it's smile and be typical. Like most of us when we're actually asleep is like Homer Simpson, right? Like drool coming out. Like imagine if Sleeping Beauty was actually sleeping. Like she'd actually been there surrounded by like thorns for how many years? She'd be covered in freaking dust. Like that scene in Westworld this season. And like she'd be rough, man. Like did her hair keep growing? Did her nails keep growing? Was she in some sort? She would have like ass mouth, and he has to kiss her. Like, whoa, reality is not part of that fantasy, right? It's a perfect, beautiful, trapped in amber, passive femininity that you are just so inherently perfect that a man falls in love with you and you don't have to do fuck all. It's female power fantasy. It is. That's why the story's called Sleeping Beauty and not Prince Charming, okay? This guy goes through heaven and earth. He fights a freaking dragon and goes through thorns and all for the beautiful princess. And, the moral of the story is, ladies, if you're a beautiful princess, men will move mountains. Men will jump through any hoop you want to be with you. Guess what? It doesn't work that way in the real world. It doesn't. It just doesn't. No matter what they tell you, it doesn't. And that's the problem with power fantasies in general. They do tend, if they're overdone, like Sleeping Beauty is. Sleeping Beauty is the one Disney princess who literally like sleeps, right? Sleep, right? She doesn't snore. No, snoring's not perfectly princessy enough. But like at least Snow White like knows how to pick up a place. And the thing about Snow White is she's not just beautiful, she's like very nice too. Ariel in The Little Mermaid's adventurous, and Belle likes to read, she's smart. Disney is, as they went along, and Cinderella, you kind of feel for her because she's so mistreated and she still keeps a really positive attitude. Most of these princesses do shit, and there's a character element. And so this seems, in a lot of ways, less negative portrayals, right? Negative messaging to young girls. But it goes the same way with men, right? Like, no, women aren't necessarily into ridiculous muscles, especially when you find out about the bad breath, mood swings, and the inability to wipe your own ass that comes with it. Most women do not want that bodybuilder look. They don't want to live with a guy who's constantly having headaches and going on about the low-carb diets and staying lean and dehydrating and all that BS. It's not a sustainable lifestyle in the real world. And where we have to get in terms of media literacy is that's nice. It's nice to look at. Do we want that in the real world? Most mature people don't. Most mature people are much more interested in somebody who's kind and considerate and reasonably motivated and has a good personality and is kind of funny. It's less important to be physically perfect, but that's not the messages the media sends. And when we get into this examination of power fantasy or sort of physically idealized constructs of men and women, we need to factor in that unattainable images of masculinity are no better or worse than unattainable images of femininity. They're both destructive. There's a happy medium. The one thing I will say that I still think, I've said it a lot, but I think it bears repeating. There is definitely much more variety in idealized male figures than there is in idealized female figures. The spectrum of ideal, right, goes all the way from, like I said, like Spider-Man and Nightcrawler and Plastic Man and those kind of guys to Hulk, right? And I'd say the ideal stops at more sort of Batman the Animated Series, not Frank Miller Batman. Like, nobody wants a dude who's square, okay? But that was an overstatement, obviously. There are plenty of people who are guys who are shaped like a square. You know, apologies to Strong Mad from Homestar Runner. But there is definitely a more diversity in the way male superheroes look than there is in female superheroes, in part just because there are a lot fewer female superheroes. And even then, there's a real distinction between imprints. Like, Marvel got on the sort of body diversity thing significantly less recently than DC. DC, I mean, Jeff Johns' run on the Justice Society. I know Leonard Kirk drew that book for a while. I don't remember. Shout out to Leonard. There were a bunch of artists, but there was a lot of biodiversity, like body diversity, on the women in the Justice Society during that run for various reasons. You know, you had Cyclone, who got like she was like a teenager and she got her costume from like the drama department, and then you had Power Girl who's like pfft. And then you had like characters who were sort of in between, and you know, Big Barda was still all over the place at the time, and then you know, you had sort of the Michael Turner Supergirl who was very kind of leggy and elongated in the body. Yes, all these women were idealized, but there were different kinds of idealized. You know, we had characters like Spoiler and Huntress before they totally assed up her costume and stuff like that. And yes, we could have done more in terms of the racial diversity back then, but in terms of body diversity, it's a lot better than what we're getting more and more in this. You can't show any woman with boobs or any woman with hips because that's objectifying. So what do we end up getting? A bunch of women who are brown hair McPonytail, who are straight up and down, built like boys with bubs. I won't even call them boobs. They're bubs because they don't make enough of a round shape to be boobs, right? They're bubs. It's the same. Guess what? Guess what, video game developers? Guess what, movie casters? Guess what, TV producers? When you keep putting the same type of look of woman on the screen with minor variations in, say, you know, how caramel a woman's skin is, as opposed to how pale, you are setting an ideal. You are setting a beauty ideal. The only way to get away from this beauty myth, from the toxicity of only one type of woman being allowed to be attractive at any given time, and it doesn't matter if it's brown hair McPonytail or like the blonde Swedish Barbie doll type model, it doesn't matter what the specifics of that singularized ideal is, as long as there's only one at a given time. And what is video game feminism giving us right now? One acceptable kind of woman, except for freaking League of Legends and Overwatch. You know, and a few honorable mentions. Cut it out. Cut it out. Your work product is totally out of step with your rhetoric. You are saying one thing and doing another and then blaming the consumer base. And you know what, gamers, man, gamers are into thick women. Trust me. Gamers are into furry women. Trust me. Gamers are into thick furry women. Trust me. Gamers will handle much more body diversity than you think they will handle. You know? What gamers tend to react to is when their video game developers seem to be creating a character who's inherently, like, deliberately plain. And so instead of going, this is a beautiful woman. I think she's beautiful. She has a unique beauty. We didn't make her look cookie cutter, but this is a stunning, beautiful, attractive woman, and we're going to present her that way, even if it's not totally expected. And yeah, we're making her just okay because that's a statement. You know, I immediately go, screw you. What do you mean just okay? What are you doing looking down your nose at a woman who looks like somebody you might encounter in the real world? You know, that's kind of its own form of misogyny, isn't it? That any real woman just, it's okay. Right? So I'm interested in what you guys hearing. That's my refresher course on it. If you like this sort of stuff, where the heck are you still? Help support this channel. Become a monthly patron. Patreon.com/DeannaK. Because I like doing this stuff, but it's really hard to make a ton of money on. Okay, thanks for watching.